Hi, I'm Reuben with Structure Tech Home Inspections, and today I'm going to talk to you about some of the most common sump system installation problems. So we've had a really dry summer here in Minnesota, but just lately we have gotten a ton of rain, and my sump pump has been going off non-stop. That's what made me think about this. And I wrote about this probably about a decade ago, but it's time to revisit this topic and just discuss some of this stuff on video. So I'm going to go over some of the most common problems we have with sump systems here and the stuff that we talk about during home inspections. To start out, what is a sump system? It's a water management system for your house. It's there to make sure that when you get a ton of rain and the ground gets saturated with water, it helps to prevent water from flooding your basement. It's not a guarantee, but it's a great line of defense against basements flooding. Now you've got this big basket below the floor of your basement. That's called your sump basket. And you're typically going to have this corrugated, perforated tubing that runs around the perimeter of your house. That's going to collect rainwater. It's going to dump it into this basket. And then as the basket starts to fill up with water, you've got a pump with a float attached to it. And as the water rises, the float rises up, and then the pump kicks on, and it kicks water out of your house. That's a sump system and a sump pump and the discharge tubing and all that fun stuff in a nutshell. So as home inspectors, the stuff that we see going wrong with it, I'm thinking it makes the most sense to start at the outside of the sump system, and that's having a secured cover. You want to have a good cover in place because we can't have little toddlers crawling around and falling head first into the sump basket. If that happens, you can see where that goes. That is a drowning issue for little kids. So you always need to have a secure cover. Now at my own house, I've got this shelving installed over the top of it, so it's not easy for me to access. At any rate, at my house, I've got it installed underneath the shelving. I've got all this stuff kind of stored on top of it. It's not very accessible, and my cover is really secure. Even though it's not screwed in place, as home inspectors, we like to see those covers screwed in place to make sure nobody's getting in there no matter what. My cover is really tight. I mean, to get it out, I've got to give it a good yank, and I mean, you can see in this video, I'm struggling to even get it off, giving it a good pull. I really got to get it off. So despite the fact that my screw is not screwed in place, I would consider this to be a secure cover. And this is installed underneath all the shelving. If the shelving were not there and someone could accidentally step on it, I'd want to make sure that the cover will also support somebody's weight. Now this is a heavy duty cover. This will support someone's weight, that's fine. But sometimes we'll see like a little piece of plexiglass or thin plastic, or if someone stepped on it, they'd break through. In those cases, we'd recommend upgrading to something a little bit more heavy duty. Now, another thing that's not ideal with my cover is that it's not airtight. In a perfect world, those covers should be airtight. If you have a house that was built in Minnesota after about June of 2009, it's going to be built to the latest radon codes, and it's going to be required to be airtight. Mine was built prior to that. It's not required. It'd still be good practice to have an airtight cover, but I have tested my house for radon a few times. I have very low levels of radon in my basement, so I'm not going out of my way to install an airtight cover. But it'd be a good practice. It would be a nice thing for me to have an airtight cover. So that's the cover. Next, you've got the discharge tubing. When that pump kicks on, you need to have it discharging to the tubing that goes up and out of the house. We want to have good tubing coming out of the pump. It should be full-size tubing. If the pump has an outlet for 1 1/4 inch tubing, needs to be at least 1 1/4. If it's 1 1/2, at least 1 1/2. Those are the only two sizes I've ever seen. I'd say 95% of the time it's going to be 1 1/2 inch tubing, and the two materials we see used for that, it's either going to be ABS or PVC. Every once in a blue moon, there are some system installers out there who will use flexible material with a smooth interior. That's great stuff too. I got no problem with that, but it's not the typical stuff that homeowners and most contractors install. So Typically it's ABS or PVC, 1.5-inch material. We should never see corrugated tubing inside of the house. That stuff is floppy, it's much more prone to leaks. It should all be smooth stuff going inside the house. So we're looking for that. It needs to be full size, needs to be secured. And then we're also looking to see that there is a check valve installed. When that pump kicks on and it pushes the water up and out of that tubing, once the pump shuts off, you don't want all the water that's in that tubing going up and out of the house to just dump back down into your sump pump and potentially, depending on how far that tubing goes, maybe even reactivate your sump pump with the volume of water that all that tubing will hold. So we want to have a check valve installed, something that prevents the water from dumping back down. You can see in mine, there's the check valve. So we're looking for a check valve. And side note, I want to point out something that I've seen some home inspectors write up as a problem, but it's not. And it's a hole in your discharge tubing inside of the sump basket. This is actually something that I think most sump pump manufacturers require, is a weep hole or a relief hole or a drain hole in the tubing inside of the sump basket. And usually it's going to be a 3/16-inch hole. In a perfect world, when this hole is drilled into the tubing, it's going to be drilled up at a 45-degree angle so that when your pump kicks on, water is going to leak out of that hole downward. It's going to splash down into the bottom of the basket, not up and out of the basket, but whatever. We're not going to get too nitpicky on the direction of that hole. But that hole is required by sump pump manufacturers. So when we see water shooting out of the pipe when the pump kicks on, we don't need to get whipped up. It's perfectly acceptable. So that's some of the stuff we're looking for inside the pump. And now let's talk about the tubing once it leaves the house. We want to make sure that the water gets directed well away from the foundation. If you have a pipe that exits the side of the foundation and then it just dumps right next to the house, you got the potential for water to leak right along the side of the foundation and make its way right back into the same drain tile, kind of creating a short circuit, a loop, and it just repeats over and over again. So we never want the water discharging next to the house. Now, if we're doing a home inspection and we go down in the sump pump and it's bone dry, it looks like it never gets used, maybe there's not even a pump installed, but there is some discharge tubing installed and it terminates next to the side of the house, fine, no problem. It's not doing anything, who cares? But when you have an active system, you want to make sure that that water is getting carried well away from the foundation. And I'd say the cheapest, easiest, least ideal way of doing that is to just pick up some corrugated stuff at the store. It's cheap, it'll be like $10 for a 25-foot roll or something like that. It's really easy to attach to the end of your PVC piping coming out the side of the house. You just attach it, you run it out into your yard, getting it well away from the foundation, and you let it sit there all summer. It's kind of a nuisance because you're gonna have to move it every time you mow the lawn, and you're gonna need to remember to put it back where it was. You don't want to run it over into your neighbor's house. That wouldn't be a very neighborly thing to do, to bring it all the way across if you got close neighbors nearby. And then it's really, really important, if you do go this route, critically important, I gotta get close to the camera because this is such a big deal, critically important, you need to disconnect that tubing come winter time. If you don't, there's a good chance you're going to flood your basement. What ends up happening is your pump kicks on at some point in the winter, it fills that corrugated tubing with water, it turns to ice, and eventually it fills with ice. It gets completely blocked, and then come springtime, you get all this groundwater, you get all this melt, thawing of the snow, and then your pump kicks on, and it can't pump the water out, and it gets stuck there, and then your sump basket fills up with water, and you end up with a flooded basement. I've heard it happening numerous times. I have had a few neighbors who had that happen to them. I almost had it happen to me one time. I remember coming downstairs, dead of winter, and my office was in the basement. I heard this low whirring noise that wasn't typical. I wasn't fully awake, and eventually I went to check. I was like, what is that noise after about an hour? And I found my sump pump running continuously. It was trying to pump water out, but I had forgotten to disconnect the discharge, the corrugated discharge tubing at the outside, and so the pump was just running non-stop, probably taking years off the life of that motor. It was actually steaming inside the sump basket because it was so hot. And I went, oh, I'm the world's biggest idiot. I've told a million people to remember to disconnect this tubing, and here I forget to do it myself. So don't forget to do that. If you have that set up, disconnect it in the winter. So, like I said, this is the cheapest, easiest way to direct that water away from your house. A better way to do it, and this is what I have at my current house, is to have discharge tubing, smooth interior tubing that runs underground, and it's going to run way out into the yard. You can see mine, it kind of disappears underground. The previous owners set this up, and it goes right into the middle of the backyard. It just terminates there. You can see it's been hit with the lawnmower a couple of times when the grass was a lot shorter. Right now the grass is a lot longer, it doesn't matter. And then this is what it looks like when the sump pump kicks on. You can see there's just a bunch of water coming out. Sorry, my dog's getting in the way here. Hi Sarge, that's Sarge. He's a German Shepherd and he's very curious about these types of things. Couldn't get him out of the shot for this. But there's water discharging out of it, that's what it looks like. And that's a nice setup. This is out of the way, it's kind of maintenance free, never need to do anything about it. It is never frozen in the wintertime. But what would be even better than that, I think probably the best solution, and this is what I had installed myself at my last house, would be to have your discharge tubing coming out the side of the house and have it just kind of pointing down into a receptor with a larger piece of tubing, maybe 3-inch tubing, smooth interior, PVC, ABS, whatever you have, and then have that running out into the yard. And what makes that a little bit better is that even if that tubing does end up freezing and it fills with water for some reason, freezes up, you're not going to be blocking anything. You're still going to have an air gap where the water can fall to go into that discharge tubing, and eventually where it goes is going to terminate at daylight, just like it does in my house. Very similar situation, but you create an air gap there. I would like that a little bit more, but you know what I have now is plenty good enough. It's certainly not worth redoing. Although I say that now, someday if my house floods, maybe I'll come back and I'll change this video. But it's been that way for about, I don't know, I've been here about 5 years, never had an issue with it. So I think that covers the most common stuff that we find as home inspectors. Hope this video was helpful. It gives you a little bit more insight into how your system works and what you ought to be doing to make sure that you don't end up with water in your basement when you get heavy rains like we've been having here in Minnesota. Okay, again, I'm Reuben Saltzman with Structure Tech Home Inspections. Thank you so much for watching. Take care.